My name, for those of you who don't know, I'm Jim Sloan, the Assistant Commandant for Intelligence and Criminal Investigation. And I'm delighted today to bring before the Board of Trustees Dr. Kerr, who is now the Principal Deputy Director of National Intelligence. And I should just say a few things about Dr. Kerr and the position he currently holds. Shortly after September 11th, there was a lot of angst in the government about the unity of effort relative to the intelligence programs in the United States. And as most of you know, the Coast Guard is one of the 16 members of the intelligence community. In late 2004, Congress passed and the President signed what was known as the Intelligence and Terrorist Prevention Act, and it created the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and essentially created a center of gravity for all of the intelligence community to rally around relative to the product that we each provide to the national effort. We are, quite frankly, one of the smallest members of the community. Dr. Kerr, before he came to the Director of National Intelligence, in addition to having been a former Assistant Director of the FBI, Director of Los Alamos, was the Director of perhaps the largest agency, at least budget-wise, in the intelligence community. That's the National Reconnaissance Office. I think it's fitting that Dr. Kerr come up here and address the Board of Trustees, because we're about to enter, for the next couple of hours, an intensive discussion on the intelligence programs as they affect our cadets and our candidates. And I'm pretty proud of the fact that we have a robust intelligence program up here, but I'm prouder of the fact that we've got Dr. Kerr to come up and say a few words to the Board of Trustees and later to the cadets relative to the larger intelligence activity in the United States. Dr. Kerr.
Thank you very much, Jim, and thank you all for your welcome. A thing Jim missed while I was waiting the end of the endless process of confirmation, I also had the opportunity to visit your headquarters. I got a good half hour or 45 minutes with your commandant, and I went home and told my wife, who's here with me, that he's better in person than on television. So it was a great opportunity. I've worked in and around intelligence activities for now about 40 years. And I started out, of course, as an engineer and applied physicist, and had the opportunities for some broadening experiences. And retrospectively, of course, I picked bosses that were the very best. Well, you don't really get to do that, so I was lucky. It's great to be here today because yesterday I went to New York. I spent time with the CIA station there, the FBI, the Joint Terrorism Task Force, and your District 1 intel personnel, which was just a great package because New York is probably the exemplar of intelligence, both foreign and domestic, being brought together and applied to real-world law enforcement, counter-espionage, the whole range of intelligence problems. That lesson, of course, is a hard-learned one because, as we were talking yesterday, it became clear that you can do things in New York that you can't do anyplace else. For example, they don't have an interagency process. When the commissioner says he wants something, NYPD goes and does it. And so they create facts very quickly in terms of the things that they're developing, learning, and working with every day. What we have to do, of course, is figure out how to take those processes and what they've learned and bring them into the national level discussion without attenuating them to the point that they don't have value anymore. And that's going to be a very hard thing to do. One of the things that we're trying to do with the new office of the DNI, of course, is to figure out how we add value to what all of the 16 agencies already do. The act that Jim described did provide for intelligence reform. It did provide for oversight. The president, when he signed the bill, said he wanted the community to behave as a unified, integrated enterprise. There's just one thing missing. We were given permission to use an abundance of moral suasion to get people to do the right thing, but we really didn't have any line authority over, with the exception really of the CIA. It's all by consent, if you will. And so we have a big club called the budget, but that's not the way to lead people. So part of what Admiral McConnell and I are trying to do is figure out how to, both as personal examples, through discussion, through convincing people that there are better ways to do some things than we have been doing the last several years, to move the community forward. We may be able to take advantages of future changes in the Executive Order 12333, which defines the intelligence community and some of the lines of authority that go through it. But there's some things that may ultimately require legislation. We don't hold out a lot of hope with the fractious debates going on in our legislative branch in Washington right now that it's not a good time to go and seek legislative remedies. They become partisan the second day. So we'll be doing what we can through our personal efforts, through the executive order, and of course with the cooperation of the 16 agencies that are, in fact, our intelligence community. The most difficult thing we have to do is the integration of foreign intelligence and domestic information and intelligence. It's a divide that's been there for years. What's interesting to me about the Coast Guard is that you've lived in that environment for a long, long time. And you're able to carry out your law enforcement responsibilities, your military service, and you have intelligence as part of your mission as well. I know you have other missions, but just for the sake of what I'm trying to make the point on, these are not things that many agencies feel can work well together. And you'd see these things segregated in some other places, whereas you, through the way you develop your people, bring them along familiar with the authorities, the responsibilities, to understand these different mission areas without getting in a great deal of trouble. That's something we're going to have to learn from as well. We know that there are legal strictures clearly with domestic information and intelligence. We're not saying we're going to take grand jury material and disseminate it to the world. We can't do that. On the other hand, there's an awful lot of fusion of information and teamed operations that take advantage of different authorities that reside with different agencies that we can build on. And so one of the things we're hoping to do is learn a lot from your experience. And of course, Joe Rhodes, who's here with me, is in fact now the new assistant DDNI for education and training, and will be an interface with the academy and other institutions like it across the community. Whether we actually go for bricks and mortars in terms of a national intelligence university, or whether we do more of it in a more virtual way with facilities that exist and programs that exist, we don't know. But my guess is that budget realities and the existence of strong programs will lead us to a lot of virtual work. The other thing that I think we could offer the academy is sort of, what do intelligence officers look like? What's been the path by which they've gotten to the kinds of jobs, the kinds of opportunities that they see? I'm an engineer and a physicist. I have colleagues who are historians, political scientists. When I was at CIA, I had a group that did cosmetics. They were the people who worked on disguise, and their peer group were makeup artists in Hollywood. And so we can fit almost any discipline and skill into the intelligence community because we need them all. And so, the big lesson for a lot of us is that it's not always where you came from, but your willingness to accept that you were in a world that took a lot more breadth and a lot more understanding to apply the right resources to a problem. Another thing you do that I think is very helpful is your people do operational tours before they, in fact, move on to intelligence as a specialty. That's actually a good thing in terms of what I've seen, for example, when I was at CIA. It was helpful to us to have people with the maturity that went with either an operational tour in the service or a 5 or 7 or 10 year experience in industry. They had a few more miles on them. Some of the edges had been ground down a little bit, and they had the maturity to accept this environment that was quite new for them as they came in. And so it also is something to think about. But I guess the thing that worries me most today, we're of course driven by people who always want to talk about efficiency. And they say, flatten the organization. That's one way to get efficiency. But I like to remind people what we give up when we do that. I think an awful lot of developing intelligence officers over their careers has to do with mentoring. To the degree we flatten organizations too much, the ability of the seniors to provide mentoring to those they lead is reduced. You just don't have enough hours to do it. I don't know any way to accelerate mentoring. It's not something you can do on a laptop. It really is human contact, discussion about career opportunities, discussion about educational opportunities that should be picked up. And so I'm hoping I'll be joined at some point by people who push back on simple measures of efficiency and ask, what do we get over a career in terms of people with the breadth of experience, the depth of knowledge, and the maturity to apply them to some of our very, very difficult problems. So if any of you are like-minded in that, I think it's a sensible point. I'll welcome your help. Like Jim, I've worked in a few different agencies, not because I couldn't keep a job, but in fact, I had the opportunity over time to be challenged by some very different things. I was the first assistant director of the FBI they ever hired from the outside. I don't think they're sorry about it, but I was the guy who went there when the FBI laboratory was getting all that bad press about tampering with evidence, giving testimony that hadn't been quite fully vetted, and ultimately got them accredited before my friend George Tenet said, okay, enough of that, you're coming over to CIA. But I've enjoyed all of those different opportunities. Clearly, we want to find ways for some of your people to have equivalent challenges as part of their careers in the Coast Guard. So I'll look forward to working with you. I'd be happy to answer questions if you have.
You mentioned there's obviously some common leadership and management traits of somebody that's successful in the organization. What kind of intellectual characteristics make a successful person in that program, from your perspective?
Actually, intelligence officers come in several different models, but I think persistence and tenacity is buried at the core for a lot of them. People who come against intractable problems at the outset and find ways, and whether it involves, for example, technical operations and tagging and tracking and new collection, or the application of better analytic capabilities, reaching out in the community to experts that they need. It really is the problem focus that I think does it for most of them. If you're not driven by the mission and the problem, I don't think you find people who are successful.
Yes, sir.
Any others?
Well, Dr. Kerr, we're going to hear, I'd stand, but it'd take me 15
No, you
minutes.
shouldn't.
We're going to hear from you again at lunch.
Right.
And I think we're on schedule to head over to the dedication of something that I'm pretty proud of, and that's the intelligence classroom, the SuperNet classroom.
That's why I tried to finish on time.
Yeah. Very good. Thank you very much. Sorry, folks.
I'm supposed to say seats, please, according to the script. Dr. Kerr, Mr. Sloan, Rear Admiral Burho, distinguished visitors and distinguished members of the Board of Trustees, faculty and staff, good morning. Thank you for coming today to help us recognize this milestone for the intelligence program and for the United States Coast Guard Academy, as we dedicate the Secret Internet Protocol Router Network, or SuperNet classroom. Although it may look like an ordinary classroom upon initial viewing, it's the access to the classified materials, technology, systems, and information that make this classroom unique and the first of its kind at a military service academy. It is my honor to introduce the Superintendent of the Coast Guard Academy, Rear Admiral Burho.
Thanks, Mike. Dr. Kerr, it's great to have you here. Appreciate the information that you provided to the Board of Trustees, and looking forward to hearing you at lunch, which is one of the reasons we decided to go ahead and move in here. We alter the plan, and I will alter my comments as well. But I did want to make sure that I said at least one thing nice about Mr. Sloan. There's only one thing that I miss about Coast Guard headquarters, and that's having lunch with Mr. Sloan and listening to his stories and talking with him, and I really appreciate that. And I also miss the morning meetings that we used to have with the Commandant. There was one morning that I liked in particular because my job when I was there in public affairs was to review all the articles. And there was one great article that morning, and the title of it was Sloan, James Sloan, the Coast Guard's only spy. And so it was fun for me to be able to introduce that article that morning, and it's fun to hear the Commandant refer to him as Sloan, James Sloan, for the next week. And I don't get to have that fun around here. It really is great to have you here, and I really appreciate all that you have done to help us with this classroom. I really am excited about the classroom, excited about the opportunity. I got to admit I was a little nervous, and I was checking with Mike Bennett. I was talking with a reporter yesterday about the things that have happened great here at the Coast Guard Academy, of which one is our ability to be able to build this classroom, the first of any service academy. I know that we won't be the last, and I'm claiming until proven otherwise that we're the only undergraduate institution to have a classroom like this. And so I shared with the reporter that, and then all of a sudden I thought, uh-oh, did I share too much with the reporter about a secret classroom? But I talked to Mike Bennett on the way over, and he said that I didn't. And I also wanted to make sure that we gave some credit to Mike Bennett and Jeff Dolan for the great work that they did and the persistence that they showed in having this become a reality. And so congratulations and thanks to both of you. And we have a plaque that's going to be in the front of this classroom. There was a little bit of a move afoot to call this the Jim Sloan Internet
Sloan James.
SuperNet classroom, but we decided instead we would put a plaque outside the classroom. It'll be called Strategic Intelligence Classroom, made possible through the vision, resources, and dedicated support of the Assistant Commandant of Intelligence Criminal Investigations, Mr. James Sloan. So we'll put this on the outside.
I'm just going to say a couple of quick words. I won't say one good thing about Scott. There's too many good things to say about him. Dr. Kerr, thank you very much for being up here. Obviously I'm not running like I used to when I was a Secret Service agent, but I got here. That's the important part. Interestingly, today marks the 4th year of my service to the Coast Guard, which I find somewhat ironic to the extent that it was 4 years ago, probably tomorrow or next week, that we made a decision at CG2 along with the cooperation of others, to include the Academy and the Joint Military Intelligence College, which was then known, now it's the National Defense Intelligence College, that one of the most important things that we could do for the purposes of the intelligence culture in the Coast Guard was to infuse the session points for officers with an intelligence training environment. And I think that based on the work of Lieutenant Commander Bennett, Lieutenant Commander Dolan, and others here at the Academy, in fact, I should point out that Dr. Judy Youngman and I actually met up here for that purpose back 4 years ago. And thanks to everybody involved, I think it's been a huge success. The second one, of course, was to get a chair at the Joint Military Intelligence College, which we've done also. And the idea that we can familiarize cadets and candidates, and at the Joint Military Intelligence College, enlisted personnel from all over the Coast Guard with an understanding of the importance of intelligence and how important intelligence is organically to the Coast Guard first, and then how the organic mission of the Coast Guard Intelligence Program serves the larger national effort. I think it's been a success. So without saying much more, I think we'll open up the classroom. And I appreciate everybody's attendance, and I'm sorry to make you late. All right.
They really work, too.
All right. Right.
I'd like to invite everybody to view the classroom, and then we'll go back to the Officers Club for a luncheon with Dr. Kerr. We'll give a keynote address, and the Society for Politics and International Affairs.
All right, we got a
cadet.
So today introduce Dr. Donald M. Kerr, Principal Deputy Director of National Intelligence, Office of Director of National Intelligence. Dr. Kerr was confirmed to this position in October 2007 by the Senate. He has served numerous positions in the intelligence community. He has served with the Central Intelligence Agency as the Deputy Director for Science and Technology. He has served as the Assistant Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, where he was responsible for the laboratory division. He has served numerous positions at the Los Alamos Laboratory in New Mexico, and he has served as the Assistant Secretary for Defense Programs and later for Energy Technology. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kerr.
Dan, thank you very much. You passed the real test, was keep it short, which is a pleasure for me. I'm really happy to be here today and honored to have so many seniors from the Coast Guard present. Rear Admiral Scott Burho, of course, Superintendent here, has given me a warm welcome. Admiral Cliff Pearson, President of your Board of Trustees. It was a pleasure to meet with the board. My friend, Jim Sloan, who we've traded stories over the last several years as we've migrated to different jobs. And then Dave Koski, who I met at Coast Guard headquarters, and it's awfully good to see him again, particularly now that he's nominated to get another star. So that's terrific, as Cliff Pearson has been as well. I'm glad that I'm accompanied today by Jill Rhodes. Jill's sitting next to Jim Sloan. She's the Assistant Deputy Director of National Intelligence for Education, Training, Integration, and Collaboration. What it really means is, at the intelligence community level, she's really working the question of how we get the best of training, education, and other opportunities to people across the whole community, leveraging what's done well. And one reason she's here today, as am I, is there's an awful lot that's being done well right here in London. It's a big title for her. but a big job as we try to integrate a community that's only recently been coming together. In preparing for today's talk, I've had the opportunity to hear about some of the work that you've done here, creating your intelligence education program, some of the ideas that are still coming along, and I can't help but be impressed by, in fact, the scope and the breadth of all that you're doing. You do intelligence education right. You've got people who, in fact, really care about the mission. You have a third of the Coast Guard's Rear Admirals and 2 flag equivalent SESs on your board of trustees. That's a really great investment of senior time in overseeing the program that you have. You're growing the course offerings and really moving out in areas like open source, geospatial intelligence, and I'm sure you'll move into other disciplines as it's appropriate to do so. And of course, you're not just limiting what you do to the classroom, but hopefully from an expanding internship program that you've worked across the community, you'll gain some firsthand experience working in some of the other agencies on current issues and get a real sense of the community that you're joining. Now, a lot of schools, from Notre Dame to the Naval Academy, talk about their intelligence education. You're one of only 2 undergraduate institutions that combine classified with unclassified information. Don't get me wrong, you can learn about a lot from open source, but that provides a context for other information that's hard-won and adds an awful lot of value to that which is available. And of course, I had the privilege a few minutes ago of watching the ribbon cutting for your new dedicated SIPRNet classroom, which is a great achievement and really a tribute to Jim Sloan's tenacity as well. So it was a great thing to share that opportunity with you. You put it all to good use. I was able to hear about some of your research topics that peers have written about, from China's military modernization to the synthetic drug trade. And you're looking at some of the same issues that our community analysts are spending their days poring over. Before I get into some of that, perhaps I should tell you how someone like me ends up doing the sorts of things that I've been so privileged to do. I started out as an engineer, and by the time I finished graduate school, I had done work on plasma physics and microwave electronics. I also had the privilege of minoring in the history of science for my PhD. That helped in a couple of ways. I learned to write a little better than most of the engineers, and I had a little more depth in terms of some of the things that I was learning. So that was a good thing. I went off to Los Alamos to find that I was part of a group of people who worried about things like high altitude nuclear weapons effects, and importantly, treaty monitoring and nuclear test detection. And we were working on things like the Vela satellites that were in existence at that time to detect atmospheric tests. I was lucky. Retrospectively, you could say I chose my bosses very well. But of course, that's not the way it really works. It is a matter of luck and a matter of taking opportunities when they present themselves. One such was after I'd spent 10 years at Los Alamos, I did my first stint within the federal government at the Department of Energy and had the good fortune to work for Jim Schlesinger, the first secretary there. I'll never forget one Saturday morning. He asked me to write a short paper to support negotiations at the UN on cessation of production of fissile material in the United States and in the world. I really knew about it. This was an area that I was responsible for, among others. I wrote, I thought, just a great 2-pager for him. It was going to be put to use with seniors in the government. I took it to him. He read it, took his pipe out, banged it on the table, and he said, "Don, didn't they teach you to write any better than this at Cornell?" He said, "You forgot one really important thing, the audience." It turned out this paper had an audience of one. It was the president at the time. And what I learned from Jim Schlesinger at that point was, how do you get a second shot to make your argument? He went through my paper. He changed 2 words to the most obscure synonyms that he knew for those 2 words. And he said, next week, when I go to the cabinet meeting, the president won't ask me what the words meant, but it'll give me an opportunity to talk about the argument in the paper and see if we can convince him by that. I've remembered it ever since. I share it with you. You may find it an advantageous way to do it yourselves, either in the careers you're starting here as you leave the Coast Guard Academy, or the ones you're in for the seniors present. The other thing that's important, you need a support group. In my case, my wife Allison is here with me, and she's been putting up with these moves and stops in a long career of some 45 plus years, and is at the core of that support group. So it's something you all should think about too as you move along. Now I'd like to talk about the intelligence community that you've heard so much about, and what is this thing called the Director of National Intelligence and the office that he heads. The quick and dirty overview is, in the wake of 9/11, we had a commission called the 9/11 Commission. Another one that was formed was the WMD Commission. Their 2 reports led the Congress to craft legislation that was passed in 2004. The president signed it, and it was called the Intelligence Reform and Terrorist Protection Act. When the president signed it almost 3 years ago, he said what he wanted was an intelligence community that acted as a unified, integrated enterprise. The expectation, of course, is that the 16 agencies that comprise the intelligence community would find common cause under the rubric of this act and go to work to be an integrated, unified enterprise. Unfortunately, a few things were left out of the legislation. The Director of National Intelligence is not the line manager for the 16 agencies. There's one that we can influence more than any other, but I think you're all aware that some 80% of the intelligence resources in the United States are in the Department of Defense. And so there's this guy, he's a cabinet secretary, the SecDef, a big influence in Washington. And so what you find throughout this is we have unlimited ability to try to convince people to do the right thing, but we don't have line authority in most cases to do that. We do have a big club in that we're responsible for the budget for the whole community, but that's a pretty blunt instrument, and it's not one that leads necessarily to the kind of behaviors that we're looking for. We reorganized the community, though, and have a Director of National Intelligence. The DNI is additionally the principal intelligence advisor to the President of the United States. So I think that makes it clear what my job is. In the Act, I have all the authorities that the Director does, but I'm the guy who has to make sure the internal part of the business works. So in some rough sense, I serve as kind of a chief operating officer, and when the DNI is not available, I also get the morning duty with the President, which is actually an honor and a privilege to be in that position. There are a number of things the Act said that we would do as part of the stand-up of the DNI, and we're hard at work doing that today. Clearly making collection more efficient, more mission-focused, that it's accurate, available in a timely way to objectively guide decision makers across the government is a really mainline commitment of the DNI. We're working very hard in the analytic enterprise because that's in fact where our product meets the user. And we have to be sure that we can accurately give people who use our products some sense of the confidence we have in the estimates. I used to like to kid people I worked with. I would say, based on serving at the FBI, in law enforcement, you tend to study history. The crime's often been committed, and you're marshaling the facts and evidence for a successful prosecution. On the intelligence side, we're dealing, in some cases, with events that have not yet taken place. You're trying to divine plans and intentions of people who you may not know as well as you should, and you never have enough data to have absolute confidence in what you're going to provide as an estimate. But that said, you have to do the very best you can to give the people you serve confidence in the information you're providing. And so that's another key factor of what we're doing today. The best tools and techniques, policies in the world wouldn't mean much if we didn't have clear direction guiding them. And that's bound up in an effort we're conducting today. We've gone through a 100-day plan that Admiral McConnell put in place when he became the second DNI. And today we're working on what we call the 500-day plan, although I've just shortened it to 400 days because I noticed that all of the milestones at the end of the effort were at the very end of 2008. Well, that's after an election takes place. And the community is going to have transition teams and others all over, trying to think of what should happen next. So we've converted it to a 400-day plan, and then we're going to fix things in the last 100 days that we might not have gotten right. So we're hard at work on that, and we'll see how we can link objectives and goals and metrics for accomplishment as we go along. Another characteristic of the intelligence community is what people have called the stovepipe mentality. It's the mindset that an agency collects, produces, and controls information in their discipline. And it obviously grows out of the past practices in areas like SIGINT and imagery, some of the other areas where we collect. But now, of course, analysts and users really are agnostic about the actual source of collection. They care what the information is, they care what confidence there is, and I think maybe the best way to think about it is the data doesn't belong to an agency, it belongs to the taxpayers. We're stewards of that data, just as we're stewards of their money, and part of our responsibility is to make sure that the data arrives where it's needed in a timely way. And that's crucial for the kind of operations that we're conducting today. We've created mission managers for some of our hardest problems. Not surprisingly, North Korea, Iran. We've tied Cuba and Venezuela together. You only need to read the newspaper to understand why that's of interest to us. Counterterrorism through the NCTC, counterproliferation, and counterintelligence. It doesn't mean that every hard problem gets a mission manager, and in fact, sometimes we don't name a mission manager. We don't have one for China. And that's because people would think that we've taken a position about our relationship with China, which is such a complex thing, and it's in an economic setting that's not limited just to China. You only have to think about that famous Chinese city in North America called Vancouver. There are lots of other cities of that sort. The mission managers are one-stop shops for the best information that we as a community can bring to support their mission. They're able to reach out to all of the agencies in terms of adding emphasis, shifting resources from time to time, and they have an overall picture of their problem. And so, for example, when the president does a deep dive on Iran, the Iran mission manager is there in the Oval Office with all of the depth of knowledge that she brings to that problem set. What does information sharing mean today? That was another imperative in the Act. Some people felt that it just meant changing the classification rules, but there's a lot more to it. It's connectivity, it's people being prepared to act on information. And I can give you an example of one such of a couple of years ago. NCTC, for counterterrorism, received information that 2 individuals were aboard a flight bound for Mexico that would be crossing U.S. airspace. The flight, which originated in the Middle East, was not a U.S. carrier, not scheduled to land in the United States, and there was no requirement for a passenger list prior to takeoff. 2 passengers, however, appeared suspicious to the foreign airlines ticket agents in Europe. The flight departed before names could be checked. The foreign airline then contacted U.S. authorities providing the names and flight information. A classified conference call ensued to assess the potential threat. It first went to NCTC's Operations Center with the names and requested any information to assist in decision-making. They found information that the 2 were on the no-fly list. They were added right after 9/11. And although there was little indication of any activity that they were about to conduct, there was a great concern that they be overflying the United States. While the information was being assembled, the Terrorist Screening Center discovered that both of them had pilot's licenses. That was an interesting fact. And based on that, the aircraft was ultimately denied entry into U.S. airspace and returned to Europe. Now, did we avoid something? We don't know. But it was, in fact, a case where some of the new connectivity, the new relationships that have been formed post 9/11, I think worked the way they were supposed to. When minutes count, of course, the importance of collaboration is clear. But even when time isn't of the essence, working together, for example, fusing SIGINT from NSA with HUMINT reporting from CIA, is vital to protect our nation. And it's important that these different disciplines work together. If you asked a question of how reliable is SIGINT, it's as reliable as the conversations you have with people every day. People's memories are adjustable. People in conversation try to please their interlocutors, and particularly if you're paying them for information, they like getting paid regularly. So SIGINT becomes important because you may hear them in a more unguarded way talking about the same subject. It's the way, in fact, you develop confidence in an intelligence estimate to have these very different means of collecting information. That's what the ODNI is up to, and it's the biggest challenge we face. Now, countering terrorism is only one of the things that challenges us today. There's some other technological challenges, cultural challenges, and societal challenges. And I thought I might mention a few of them just to give you an example of the landscape that we're looking at and trying to work in. In the technological area, I think you're all aware from press coverage that there are cyber attacks ongoing. They're not just against information that belongs to the U.S. government. They're pervasive. They go into the financial areas, intellectual property that many of our companies are trying to safeguard. They want to take advantage of the internet to do business more efficiently, and in doing so, they in effect put their own intellectual property at risk. If I had to talk about the root of the technical problem, we're really used to tracking things in physical space. We have AIS, we track ships, we can put beacons on things. We can go into cyberspace. We can go and do exploits in the network. The thing we don't know how to do is we don't know how to geolocate things in cyberspace. And so if we identify a bad person doing things in cyberspace, we're unable to target that person in real physical space to take action. And that's a hard technical problem, one that a lot of people are trying to work on. And whether there is a solution or not, I don't know. But it's certainly something that we have to attend to. Second area is that we need the people to work on cybersecurity and the collection and analysis of the information that we get operating on the networks. For the cadets, many of your generation, in effect, has grown up with cyberspace and cyber technology as part of the kit of tools that you bring to your education and to your future jobs. What we need to do, of course, is find ways to challenge you to use that knowledge and experience against some of these very hard problems that we have today. There are really 3 pieces of it. There's computer network exploitation. That's simply gathering information. There's computer network attack, which is when the U.S., under proper authorities, takes action in the networks to do something to an adversary. That's really a military problem, if you will. And now more and more people are trying to think through computer network defense and what that will mean in the future. Cultural issues. We have something like 100,000 people in the intelligence community from 16 different agencies. They have pride. Some of them are of long-standing. They've been around for a couple of hundred years, like this one. Some of them are very new to the scene. But even they work hard to create lore, create a sense of culture and an approach to their job that allows them to do it very well. As we try to integrate the community, we can't say they all have to behave the same way. What we have to do is get people used to the idea that there's connectivity that joins them, there's some rules for using that connectivity, and there's some obligations that come from being on the network in terms of protecting sources and methods, a whole host of other things that would occur to you. And most importantly, how do we forge common purpose with people who are trained as differently, say, as FBI agents on the one hand and NGA imagery analysts on the other? And so part of the education and training activity and part of the integration activity broadly for the DNI is to deal with joining these cultures to advantage, not for argument. Different generations, another part of our problem. For example, more than half of the CIA workforce has entered on duty since 9/11. That's really a problem, and it's not unique to CIA. But we had the peace dividend of the 90s, and consequently there were diminished numbers of people hired, and today, as we're expanding the workforce again across the community, we have a very bimodal distribution. We have a lot of people on the precipice of retirement, and we have a lot of people in the 0 to 5 years class. And so the hardest job of all is transferring knowledge and experience from the precipice of retirement to the 0 to 5 year group. And in some cases, the experience isn't even relevant because some things have changed so much in the intervening period. And so we're going to have to spend a lot of time thinking about how we mentor, how we give training and education opportunities, and how we particularly can share experiences before the people who've internalized those experiences leave the scene and would be unable to do it other than on videotape. One of the things we've done recently in the analytic area, we've created a thing called A-Space. You might think of it as MySpace for analysts. It's one of the first things we've done to really integrate the analytic community across the whole intelligence enterprise. They're going to use the techniques of synthetic worlds. They're going to learn how to do searches and collaboration in an environment that's never been available to intelligence analysts before. That's an exciting thing. I can't say that Mod 0 that we've just rolled out is the right answer. I think the users are going to redefine it. We'll probably be on version 3.0 within a year, but there'll be opportunities for feedback and change. We also, of course, are operating in a world where it used to be the responsibility to secure governed our behavior as intelligence officers. We're now in a place where responsibility to provide is the dominant force, and we have to learn to do that while protecting things that are sensitive. And in particular, we have to protect things from those in the press who just love to publish it for our adversaries' benefit. And so we're working hard at that too. Tools, technical tools, are an important part of the intelligence business. I'm not just making an argument for my tribe in this case. But while I was at CIA, I had the responsibility for all of the tech ops officers. And some of you might think, well, they're just engineers, right? Well, it turns out there were history majors, there were people who did cosmetics, there were people who did printing, because the whole tradecraft for doing close access requires everything from alias docs to communications devices to disguise, all of the things you need to get close to a target. And it's not just engineers who know how to do those things. So when people start talking about technical ops, you shouldn't feel excluded if your background is in engineering. On the other hand, if you are an engineer, you ought to know that there are opportunities for scientists, engineers, and people of all disciplines across the intelligence community. You can't mount the kind of efforts that our community does without having a breadth of skills that's just astounding. And so I wouldn't want anyone to think it's not for me because I'm not a whatever major. There's opportunity for everyone. You ought to look hard and see if the challenges fit your interest. The thing I like about it is, why come back to government when, one could be certainly less at the disposal of other people and perhaps even financially better off. I think the bottom line is there's no other thing that you can do where you can do the things I do every day. Other people just don't have those opportunities. And that's not true of just one person in the intelligence community. It's true of a great number. There are opportunities for a great deal of authority and responsibility early in a career. That's a good thing. But in fact, the ability to link together different capabilities to go after certain targets, analyze certain problems, is a privilege that no one else is given. I find that really exciting. It's what gets me to work every day. Now, we have to think about some of the societal factors too. Some of you are familiar with the Drudge Report. This was kind of a top story, and I hear a few of you actually looked into it. I went off to San Antonio innocently about 3 weeks ago. I gave a talk at the GeoInt conference there, and I talked a bit about the problem we have right now where some of the capabilities we think of using for intelligence purposes run afoul of some views of privacy. And I tried to make the point that the overall, if you will, national security or personal security problem really has two pieces to it. When I go to work during the day, I'm kind of concerned with safety. It's really good to be in a situation where I don't have to worry about people making either a physical or emotional attack on me. I think better that way. When I go home, I also want to have freedom from intrusion in time that I think is mine to have discretion on. But I think the argument that we have to be worried about is some equate privacy to anonymity. And so I said that in San Antonio and suggested that we ought to have a debate. And the debate may be different depending on how old you are. Some who were in the Facebook, MySpace environment may be willing to give up more privacy in order to have access to networking tools and communications tools that are unheard of. One person talked to me subsequently and said, well, when I give my social security number or credit card number and name and address to a vendor, of course I'm getting a benefit from that. I'm buying a service. I bit my tongue. I didn't remind her that probably the most important service provider in her life is going to be the United States government. And I think she's eligible for Social Security. Let's just start there. And what we really have to do is convince people that those of us who are sworn to defend the Constitution are actually as trustworthy as people with unknown, unvetted backgrounds working at internet service providers, seeing everybody's data go by. That you get the retort back always, oh, yeah, you're another one of those, I'm from the government, I'm going to help you. Well, we've got to get beyond that into a constructive debate, because otherwise the whole cybersecurity initiative will perhaps succeed at the level of protecting government information and fail at doing things that are much more important, which is protecting our economic life. And we need to pay great attention to that. I had the feeling after I read the clips this morning, some of the bloggers that I was being accused of clubbing baby seals. I have to do better than that. I'll figure out next time how to put a few more hooks in the talk to avoid that. As we work on intelligence reform, we'd be wise to look to the Coast Guard for some guidance. As the only government agency that has simultaneous responsibilities for law enforcement, military, and intelligence activities, you've been collaborating and coordinating long before it was popular. Let me tell you about one Coastie in particular and offer a glimpse of what a career as a Coast Guard intelligence officer can look like. My military assistant, Captain Jim Bjostad, has nearly 3 decades of Coast Guard service. Although his route to a commission was different than the one many of you are pursuing, he graduated from OCS in Yorktown, Virginia in 1980. He's had quite a set of experiences. His role as my military assistant is his 7th intelligence assignment. Previously, he served on the National Security Council staff, the Secretary of Transportation's National Security Staff, Coast Guard Intelligence Coordination Center, and what is now the Joint Interagency Task Force South, JITA South. He's alternated these assignments with 5 operational tours. First on the high endurance cutter as a deck watch officer and first lieutenant. Then he commanded 4 operations ashore units, including a station, 2 groups, and a sector. He's attended 3 postgraduate schools as the first Coast Guard officer assigned to the National Defense Intelligence College, followed by the Naval War College and later the Harvard National Security Program. So you see, a career in intelligence can be both very broad and very exciting. And thank goodness for that. We need people with that breadth of experience, that willingness to dedicate themselves to a set of really hard problems. From the early days of the Republic, we've depended on the Coast Guard for maritime security. We've never let the nation down. In fact, some of our darkest moments required the Coast Guard to stand up as a success story. And now as we confront the challenges of transnational terrorism, we look to you again with responsibilities in intelligence and law enforcement to help us in new ways. And you all, the men and women in our nation's most difficult to get into school, in one of the most challenging and rigorous programs, confronting some of the most pressing issues of our time, have set a high bar for yourselves, but I have no doubt for your success. So thank you all for coming this afternoon, taking the time to listen to me, and I'd be happy to answer questions if there are any. Thanks very much. Any question will do. Yes.
Sir, how do you, given the access that your employees have and your unique skill set, how do you address the issue of maintaining the trust with them, but also being mindful of the counterintelligence aspect that they're not involved in activities that can be problematic?
That's a very good point, because whether you knew it or not, we actually are looking at whether we can reform the way in which we grant access. And as you know, one of our problems as a community is that it takes months, and at times we actually lose good people because they can't stand what has been a 9-month wait. So we asked the head of State INR, the intelligence component of the Department of State. He was formerly in charge of security at Goldman Sachs. The question to him was, how long does it take to vet people, to bring them into the heart of your investment banking business, where the risks are really high if you get a bad apple? He said 3 days. Admiral McConnell, recognizing that we're now talking about the government, said he'd like to set a goal for giving that first access in 30 days. What does that really mean? It means that we internalize the fact that background investigations are not always a very good predictor of future behavior. People have life-changing experiences along the way, other pressures on them, and it shifts the burden from background investigation and routine reinvestigation to much more dependence on supervisors, in fact, paying attention to their employees, and peers being knowledgeable about what folks are doing and whether anomalous things are happening. The only way I can see to do it is to keep renewing the obligation. In one sensitive program that I had responsibility for a few years ago, we did it in an interesting way. We basically had an alumni meeting every year. We would read the people back in for that day. They could tell sea stories to their heart's content during the day, but the day ended with another security indoctrination talk, and reminded them that while they were retired and doing other things, they still retained an obligation to protect details of the program they'd served in. That seemed to work pretty well. It may be impossible to do that across the board, but we need to look for mechanisms of that sort to remind people of their obligations. And you know, at the end of the day, security and behavior are an individual's responsibility, reinforced by the leadership. And it's a line management responsibility. It's not something delegated to a security officer. One of the things I did yesterday on the way here was to stop in New York on the way, and had the opportunity to visit with the leaders of the agencies that collaborate together there across a broad range of security and intelligence functions. First with the CIA station there, with the FBI, with the JTTF, the Joint Terrorism Task Force, and in fact colleagues of yours from District 1. They're living it every day in terms of deep and interactive work on hard problems. And I think these areas where we have joint activity are the place we're going to learn about that. When I was director of the NRO, clearly you could start off with a ground station that was mainly focused on SIGINT, and then the next thing that happened was the imagery people showed up, and then later some of the MASINT capabilities. And so you ended up with a multi-ink facility. My own experience is if they're far enough from Washington, people focus on the mission overcomes all of the other cultural strange things that can happen. And we need to build on that, just as New York has been able to do it in some of the maritime security area, some of the joint work on terrorist targets. We have to find ways to replicate that and make it part of, if you will, the training curriculum and the behaviors we expect of people every day. But I don't think you teach it as much as you lead it. You give people the opportunity to serve in those kinds of environments, and they figure it out real fast. Yes?
Sir, second class finer, Charlie Company. My question is that the Director of National Intelligence was created to oversee the coming together of all the 16 intelligence agencies which create the United States intelligence system. What do you think today is the greatest impediment for the free flow of intelligence amongst the agencies?
History and culture is one piece of it, in that you're asking people to do things differently than they were originally trained in some cases. They exist in places where there are procedures that developed over the years, where the knee-jerk reaction was not to share, not to take the risk, and you have to overcome that with people who really understand what the risks and benefits are, and they're willing to do what's needed. Part of it's training, part of it's leadership. The other thing we have to deal with, it's kind of interesting, each of the agencies, in a sense, has a separate congressional committee. Congressional committees are very jealous of their purview. The Coast Guard has authorizers. They're different authorizers than some of the other intelligence agencies would have. And so we have to be careful that those who oversee us at the legislative level don't drive wedges because of their views of what jurisdictions they have in their committees. This is a very touchy subject, because the last thing any of us who serve the executive branch can do is tell the Congress how they ought to behave. And so you won't find any of your Coast Guard seniors, and you certainly won't find me doing that overtly. But we have to work hard on that in order to get the cohesion in the community that we see. Yes.
Sir, Cadet Library Exchange Cadet from West Point. I was wondering, sir, it seems that the government is extremely focused on terrorism, and given the intelligence community's obviously limited resources overall, do you feel that we're stepping behind in certain other areas, or we're losing ground in our intelligence in certain other areas?
It's a good question, because all we hear about some of the time is terrorism. But I think I mentioned earlier that we have mission managers for counterproliferation, for counterintelligence, North Korea, Iran, Venezuela, and Cuba. But you could argue that one of the broad responsibilities of the community is global situational awareness for both our political and military leadership. And so there is effort in the community that tries to do that. Now part of what we've inherited, of course, still stems back to designs from the Cold War. And so some of our capabilities are biased toward the Northern Hemisphere and the Eurasian landmass. And some of our problem sets, for example, with the stand-up of AFRICOM and continuing concerns in Latin America, we have to adjust coverage to give them the support they need. So global situational awareness is one piece. Timely, actionable information is another piece. Well, if we've learned nothing else from the engagements in Afghanistan and Iraq and Pakistan, it's the timely delivery of information. It used to be when film was the way imagery was brought from space. You'd launch, the canister would come down, be recovered, it would be delivered for processing, it would show up in Washington, and vehicles that looked like pizza trucks would take hard copy around to analysts in the Washington area. Since the advent of electro-optical capabilities and improved SIGINT capabilities, we're now measuring from collection to putting it in the hands of an operator in 2 minutes or less. So that's really actionable information. We've also learned that you've got to get down to that speed in order to get some of the fleeting targets that we're dealing with today. So that's another piece of it. I talked earlier about the improvements we need in the analytic enterprise. Another thing we have to think about is that the current fight can absorb all of the resources we have, but we still have the obligation to apply some resources against our future needs. And so that's another thing the D&I is trying to do. That it's not that we're going to short anyone on support to current operations, but we're going to be sure we protect some things against the future. We can't underinvest in the things we will need in the future. So there are lots of things to think about, but those three probably are at least at the top of my pile when I go to work. Any others? Thank you very much.
Dr. Kerr, on behalf of the Society for Political and International Affairs, I'd like to present you with a small token of our appreciation.
Great. Thanks so
Thank
much.
you, sir. That concludes this afternoon's luncheon. Thank you very much for coming, and especially thank you to Dr. Kerr for sharing his time with us.